Good morning. If everyone can take a seat. We have some extra spaces up front.
Plenty of room up front.
Well, welcome to what I know will be a very interesting and informative hour. This is really focusing on a topic that is highly relevant right now, as we're seeing things around the globe happen, if you will, in more and more frequency. So what this is really about, and let me start by saying I'm Debbie Novograd. I'm the Chief Marketing Officer and Deputy CEO for Advanced Beverage Technologies, and I'm here to moderate a session with a group of experts who all in their own way have either dealt with, helped to look at, or are working diligently on understanding smoke-impacted wines, and I'll introduce them in a moment. But as we all know around the world, there are wildfires with more and more frequency, as I said, taking place in wine-growing regions, which obviously not only impacts the wines and is causing these smoke impacts, but is causing great economic challenges as well to the vineyards, to the wineries, and the industry as a whole. So we're here to talk about what can be done about it, what is being done about it, and what else there is that we should be looking at. What questions are we still asking, and what are the next steps for trying to understand how to work with, how to solve for, or how to mitigate the smoke-impacted wines. There are several methods, as we all know, that have been used in the past. There's reverse osmosis, there's carbon, flash détente, enzymes, and recently, my own company actually has put out a multimedia approach, as well as many others. But what works? And why do they work, or why don't they work? And in the first place, how do we know if you have a smoke-impacted wine? So the industry as a whole has used two markers, guaiacol and 4-methyl-guaiacol. Are those the right markers? And what are they telling you? Are they actually indicating that you have a problem? And if they are, what do you do about it? So that's why we have our team of experts here, and I'm going to introduce each one of them in a moment. And once I do, I will let them all speak to their impact and their purpose in this space, what they know, what they're still seeking to know. And then we'll open the floor for a nice round of Q&A, which I encourage. Please participate. I think it's the way we'll all learn from each other. Now that being said, in front of you, you have two wines. Actually, you have one wine. It's the same wine in both glasses. The first is what we call the incoming wine. It is smoke impacted, if you will. And the second, the one to your right, has been treated through a multimedia approach. The reason it's there is really just for your own sensory experience. For you, if you haven't ever tried what we call smoke impacted wine, and what might look like after it's been treated. Again, this is a single wine. Every wine is different. There are different levels of impact to every wine, and the treatments create a different product at the end. So feel free to taste at your will. Feel free to ask questions about that wine as we get to the Q&A session, and basically enjoy the session. So let me share with you who we have up front here. We have Dr. Anita Oberholster, the Associate Extension Specialist in Enology. I've practiced that 5 times for UC Davis. We have Lawrence Wu Jr., or Larry, as we call him, who is the Vice President of our R&D and Innovation with Advanced Beverage Technologies, parent company of Contend. We have Ray Marsili, who is a flavor chemist and owner of Marsili Consulting. And we have Joy Mariles, who is the Director of Winemaking and Production for Shannon Ridge Family of Wines. So I will kick it off and hand it over to Dr. Oberholster to begin.
Good morning. Thank you for the invitation. So I was asked to very briefly give you a brief overview of what is smoke taint and what causes it. And that is actually more difficult than you think. So I'm going to take one little step back and say, first, what's a wine taint? So we define a wine taint as when something comes from outside, it overpowers the wine and it makes it one-dimensional. So in the case of smoke taint, this may be a very smoky, chemical, medicinal character in the wine that suppresses all other varietal characteristics. Very distinctive of smoke taint is that retronasal astray character. Okay, we say aftertaste, but it's really a flavor that you perceive in the mouth. That would be the difference with other wine taints. So what happens? So when you have a wildfire, you have a lot of vegetation burning. Now 15 to 25% of wood is lignin. So if you look at the structure of lignin, and there's a little circle there, you get thermal degradation when it burns. So basically it breaks down and you have massive amounts of those ring structures, we call them volatile phenols, being released into the air. So that is what happens during a wildfire. So now you have a grapeberry. A grapeberry is really porous. These compounds can absorb through the skin and it happens really quickly. And we think this is part of the defense mechanism of the plant, that you have enzymes that can glycosylate them. So it can attach different sugars, 1, 2, 3 sugars, onto these volatile phenols. So if you look here on the side, there's 7 different volatile phenols. Different people analyze different things, but most researchers agree that those are probably the 7 markers we feel you have to analyze to get better predictive power in research. And all of these combine to different sugars. And Ray's going to talk more about this. So just to give you an idea, it's really, really complex. The other thing is, grapes are susceptible to smoke exposure at any point in time. So basically, sorry, I'm trying to go back. So the moment you have a grapeberry, it's susceptible. But as it ripens, and specifically from berry softening, that's when it's the most sensitive to smoke exposure, specifically from berries on up to harvest. Something to remember, volatile phenols are natural compounds. They're present in grapes in any case, both free and bound. They're there. It's only during smoke exposure you can get excessive amounts. So these things don't have a health concern. It only have a quality concern. So how did my smoke taint research start? Well, one of my research projects were impacted by the fires in 2017. So I quickly realized I was making a smoke impacted wine, not a red blotch impacted wine. And so I thought, okay, let's see, what do the Australians recommend? Because they have 15 years on us as far as smoke taint research go. And they will recommend, really short, as little skin contact as possible because it's focused on the skins, do cool fermentation temperatures to try and limit extraction, use fruity yeast to get more fruity characters, use oak alternatives that will uplift the fruit, not give you any smoky or toasty characters. So I tried all of this, and what I can tell you is that they extract so quickly that even under cool temperatures, within 3 days, you have 70% of the compounds that's going to extract in any case. And that's enough to have a huge impact if you have a medium to high impacted grape. So basically then I've decided that if you can't make a rosé and it doesn't make any economic impact, you probably should just try and make the best red wine you can and then focus on amelioration. Using different yeasts and different smoke alternatives does help on the nose. On the nose, you can cover the smoke. Unfortunately, nothing really helps for that very distinctive ashtray character in the mouth. And that's really what's, for me, the most off-putting about a smoke-impacted wine. So amelioration techniques. So this is what I've been doing the last year. I've looked at different things out there that we can use to try and treat the wine after the fact. I've looked at different beta-glycosidases and even other enzymes used in the food industry that can cleave the bound that everything is in the free form. Because if everything is in the same form, it's so much easier to remove it. I can tell you nothing works. Unfortunately, under wine conditions, it's just not extreme enough for these enzymes to work fast enough to be of any practical use. I've looked at low level of activated charcoal fining, molecular imprinted polymer fining. I use reverse osmosis, both the standard differential filtration method offered by Wine Secrets, and I also teamed up with Contact looking at the spinning cone treatment. And basically I had a low, medium, and high impacted wines that I did everything on. And what I can tell you is all these techniques do work in some way. They all remove some volatile phenols, some bound phenols, more free than bound, at different levels. So no one technique removed everything. They all have some impact on matrix because all techniques lack some specificity. Nothing can focus only on the compound you're trying to remove. It does remove some other volatiles, some other non-volatiles. And that's really where I'm focusing now, is looking at the matrix effect of the different treatments and doing extensive sensory analysis to figure out what was the best option for a specific wine. I think for a low-impact wine, you probably can get away with one treatment. And for more highly impacted wine, you may have to use several different treatments or use the same treatment several times. And this is definitely what Joy is going to talk about, because she has a lot of experience, testing different techniques and playing with all these tools. The fact is there's tools, and we will continue to improve them, but we saw vast improvement in the wines that did undergo treatment. The next steps for me is really to focus on matrix effect, trying to improve the predictive power of analytical techniques, focusing on baseline data. Basically, like I said, all these compounds are natural in grapes. If you know for a specific variety, this is baseline bound and free, then you know what is elevated. This will help with grape contracts. It will help winemakers decide what is the risk associated with accepting grapes that have some exposure. And the really other very important thing is smoke. Not all smoke is equal, right? Just because you see smoke doesn't mean that you have a danger of smoke impact. We know that volatile phenols have a half-life. Anecdotally, we think it's about 24 hours. What you see when you see smoke is carbon. Carbon is not what gives you smoke taint. It's the volatile phenols that can get carried along with the carbon. So we really want to now developing prototype little setups to try and see if we can determine the half-life of volatile phenols. Unfortunately, atmospheric scientists don't really focus on that because, once again, it doesn't have a health concern. But that's where I am at the moment.
Wonderful. Thank you. Very good. Let me pass it to Larry.
Sure.
Why don't you tell us a little your experience?
So I'll start out first by saying I'm not a wine guy. I haven't worked in the wine industry very long, except this past 5 years with Contend and ABT. I'm a food science guy, so 30 how many years of experience doing innovation, new products, and just thinking about things differently. And kind of the inspiration for this idea I had of being able to take the smoke taint out of wines, both free and bound, was from a project I was doing at Contend on actually whiskey maturation, believe it or not. So I actually spent years at Brown-Forman in the new products. I ran the new products group, and so I know bourbons and whiskeys fairly well, and I know those compounds are the same, right? That create a problem in wine are good aging compounds in whiskey. And so I was working on a project where I could actually accelerate the maturation of bourbon. So I could take a 6-month-old bourbon, make it taste many, many years older without adding anything. And it was all through manipulation of these phenolic compounds. And so I thought, hey, if I can manipulate them in a bourbon, could I possibly do that in wine? And it was right around the big fires in 17, and I'm talking in our executive meeting, and I said, I think I can take smoke taint out of wine. And Tony, our owner, actually printed off an article for me. I think it was from this session. There was a session similar to this, maybe two or 3 years ago. And in the middle of that article was a big, like a quote from Dr. Oberholster, and it said, "There is no permanent removal of smoke taint in wine," or something like that.
I said currently.
Yeah, I didn't catch the currently. So it was kind of a challenge to me, and the approach is you have to think about things a little differently. So if labs can this is what I was thinking. If labs can analyze for smoke taint compounds, why can't you use that same chemistry and not just analyze and report on it, but now remove it, right? So if they can separate it to where it can be quantified and measured, then you can separate it and you should be able to remove it. That was my whole hypothesis. So I started looking at different methodologies of testing, and that's where I ran into this problem that gee, sometimes we find smoke-tainted wines that have guaiacol and 4-methyl, and then we ran into some that didn't have any 4-methyl but still had smoke, or vice versa. It had them, but they weren't smoke-tainted. So it kind of threw me, I was a little confused about that, and then I decided to talk to my whiskey chemist, analytical chemist, Ray, and I said, what's going on here? And so he explained it to me about standards and using the standards for each of the phenolic compounds to truly get an accurate understanding of what was going on. So this, to me, it's a problem with two hills that you got to cross over, barriers. First one is just, what do we really know about the chemistry and the analysis of smoke taint in wines? Before you can even say, oh, now we can take them out or we can treat it. And so that was what I ran into in my experience. So if you saw the chart from Anita, or the structure of these volatile phenolics, my target was, how do I grab them, physically grab them, and pull and separate them from the wine? And that was what my approach was. So the first step, when you look at all the existing methodologies, it seems to ruin the flavor and the aroma. All the good stuff seems to be gone, right? So I thought, okay, got to protect that. Man, that's what the spinning cone column does perfectly. I can do a heavy essence strip. I think we're doing between 2 and 4%. I can reserve that. Then I can treat the wine pretty aggressively to remove bound and free phenolics. Then I can add them back together, and you have treated or untreated becoming treated wine. And so it was very difficult to get anyone to actually admit and bring us wine to test. And so I started quietly asking some of our other customers, hey, you got any smoke-tainted wine? And one brave customer said, yeah, I've got some. How much do you need? I said, real quick, a couple of bottles, and you can actually wait, and I'll show you what happens afterwards. So it was an hour meeting. It's like, oh my gosh, this is amazing. What's next? And I said, how about a tote? And they were like, oh, I think we've got maybe a little bit more than that.
How about 19,000 gallons?
Oh,
We're going to ship it to you.
So now you know who my brave first client was. And we actually at dinner enjoyed a bottle of Pinot Noir that we treated that's almost a year old. It hasn't come back yet. So
Anita didn't even notice.
No, I didn't.
So I think we've been able to do this very well with red wines. And the other thing that I had to stick in is that the box that the TTB gives you. What can you do to treat wines? And it has to fit in that. Otherwise, there's no practicality to it. So hopefully you can see the difference between the two wines. And for me, it's like the next steps. We're only starting to uncover a lot of these pathways and understanding what's going on. And I think the biggest one is, I think we need to kind of unify around just the analysis of them in this area. I think it's just one of those, it's that giant elephant in the room that no one really talks about. And I think there's other compounds that we need to be looking for. So, but thanks very much.
Great, thank you, Larry. Perfect lead-in, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Analytics.
I am a former dairy chemist. I worked 30 years in the food industry, mostly doing dairy chemistry work, and started a consulting business about 15 years ago, and we just analyzed different kinds of food products and beverage products for whoever would submit them. And we got a lot of work in the whiskey industry, and we learned a lot about what's different between milk and whiskey. And then we ended up with beer, published some articles on off flavors in beer. Some of the same analytical techniques that we use to analyze milk, we use for alcoholic beverages. And finally, we've gone to doing wine now for the last several years. And the problem of smoke taint in wines is a very complicated problem from a chemistry point of view. Typically, we only report a couple of the phenolics as markers, but when we do our assays, we analyze for about a dozen volatile phenolics, sometimes more. And this first slide shows a list of some of the chemicals that we analyze. And you'll notice that they have different odor thresholds. So what's important is the amount of the chemical that's in the product, but also its odor threshold. So there's a varying level of intensity of impact on odor. And there's all these different odor descriptions. It's from an analytical chemist point of view and quantitating these, there's
Go ahead, Reed.
He's lost, he's looking for craft hall. You found it.
So with all these chemicals, it's a challenge. We developed different techniques for analyzing these. And it's not only is it challenging because of the number of volatile phenolics, but the volatile phenolics can be linked to sugars. They're bound, and they're released at different times in the life of a wine. And we have to get an understanding of those chemicals too, the bound phenolics. I'm not going to go through all these, what all these are, but this shows an example of what a bound phenolic looks like. And I think I read where there's over 30 different glycosidically bound volatile phenolics. Okay, and this slide just shows the method the analytical method that we use. We use a sample preparation technique first to measure the free phenolics, and it's called sequential stir-bar sorptive extraction. And it uses a 1 centimeter long polydimethyl siloxane coated stir bar. It's a magnet encased in glass and then coated with this PDMS. And it absorbs organic chemicals very well. And we actually use 2 of these stir bars, and we have 2 mils of wine, and then we put these stir bars, the bottom stir bar actually stirs, and the stir bar on the side of the vial is stationary, but it's exposed to the wine as the bottom stirs the wine. So we stir for an hour and then add 2 grams of salt and then stir for another hour, and then we remove the stir bars, rinse them with distilled water, pat the stir bars dry with a lintless cloth and put them in a thermal desorption tube. And the thermal desorption tube then is put in a rack on the instrument with an auto sampler, and it's analyzed automatically in the sequence. The stir bars in the thermal desorption tube is transferred to the thermal desorption unit. It's called a TDU. It's a Gerstle device that heats the stir bars up to desorb the volatiles that we trapped while carrier gas flows through. After the chemicals are desorbed, they're cryo-focused on the bottom of the TDU, and a cooled inlet system assists at a minus 100 degrees centigrade using liquid nitrogen. So we get a nice plug, sharp concentration of all these volatiles. After the thermal desorption cycle is completed, then the CIS is heated to 270, and the chemicals are injected into the GC column. And we see an example of a chromatogram. We have somewhere in wine between 1,000 and 1,400 chemicals that we see. So this is a complicating factor in our analysis. But with modern software that we use to process the chromatograms, we can find the chemicals that we want. To do the bound phenolics is different. What we do, we treat the phenolic compounds, the wine, with hydrochloric acid to a pH of 1.5 at 100 degrees centigrade for 4 hours. And we do this in Teflon reaction vials. We found that using glass vials doesn't work very well because these phenolics get bound on the glass. And then we sonicate the sample, add 8 mils of water and internal standard, and then we do our thermal desorption. The acid hydrolysis method was very important, and recently in 2017 there was an article published in the Journal of Ag and Food Chemistry that optimized the conditions, because initially when the technique was used, acid hydrolysis, people weren't detecting all the chemicals. They were too aggressive in their treatment or not aggressive enough. Then the other problem was the glass vials. So this was an important article to be able to get accurate quantitation of the bound phenolics. We release them and then we can analyze for them. The instrument that we use in the GC mass spec part is important. It's a LECO benchtop LC TOF MS. And it's important to us. We like it because of sensitivity and because it's able to do peak deconvolution. It has a very high sample rate of 30 sampling per second. And it allows us to get a real high data density, and we can do really good peak deconvolution. So when we have 1,400 chemicals in a chromatogram, some of them tend to elute very close together, and this software allows us to quantitate and identify the chemicals more accurately.
Not moving?
I don't know, but I think I might be done. Yeah.
There you go. Thank you.
So I'll tell you a little bit about Shannon Ridge. We grow 1,200 acres of grapes up in Lake County, and we sell fruit to many of you in the audience. And we take in 50% of what we grow and produce 340,000 cases a year, 15 brands and all of that stuff. So I've been making wine for 17 vintages now. Back in 2008, I dealt with some smoky grapes, and I think back then it was, didn't deal with them. We just had our heads in the sand and just made wine regular and wasn't sure what to do. And people were talking about reverse osmosis and, don't leave grapes on the skins for very long. And that's pretty much all we knew going into 2018 when we were inundated with fires. So just, I think back in 2008, we were afraid to ask, afraid to talk about it. Nobody wanted to air their smoky laundry. And so what I'm going to go through today is everything that we did before harvest, during harvest, and post-harvest, trying to treat these wines and trying to figure out, what works and what doesn't. Every treatment that we've gone through has their pros and cons. As Anita said, there's nothing that works perfectly. The difficult part is that each matrix of wine is independently different, and every grape varietal is different. I can have a Pinot Noir and a Petit Syrah in the same vineyard block, and the Pinot Noir is massively smoke affected, And the Petit Syrah, no big deal, can hardly even tell. And so every single wine is different. And it also depends on your program and where the wines are going and how quick they need to go to market. And, what programs they go into, what they were intended for. So I think in the end, we learned a lot. We were successful at making wines viable to the point that they can be blended and aged and bottled. And that was success for us. So anyway, okay, so pre-harvest, we came into these weeks of very smoky days and wasn't sure what to do next. So before we even harvested, we went out there and we did a fruit wash on all of our canopy. So we did a surfactant spray pretty much on every single block that we had. We didn't know if it was going to work or not, but what the heck, let's just start trying things. And so we did fruit wash, and then we came back and we washed that off with water because we were like, oh, well, what's that going to do? So, and we did see some reduction in guaiacol and 4-methyl guaiacol from pre and post fruit wash, so it made us feel better. I don't know if that really had an effect in any of the wines in the end, but felt good for a little bit. And in knowing what we knew before, which was don't leave the fruit on the skins for very long, we thought about changing our picking styles, hand harvest versus machine harvest. In the end, we said, you know what, we don't have enough time, we don't have enough labor to change one way or the other. We're just going to keep it the same. So we didn't make any changes to how we picked. Some blocks got hand picked, some blocks got machine harvested. All of our wineries and facilities are within about an hour of our vineyard, so it wasn't a huge amount of time that the grapes were sitting on the skins, for whites anyway, but that's kind of what we started with. So that was pre-harvest. During harvest, we started with the white wines, mostly Sauvignon Blanc, Chardonnay, a little bit of Pinot Gris, and we brought the fruit in. We pressed lightly, probably to 1.2 bar, 160 gallons per ton, and we cut it and we dumped it. We didn't want to risk it. We weren't really sure. All of our whites had no problems whatsoever, except the Pinot Gris. That was in a very specific valley and was pretty much burnt all around the edges. And Pinot Gris and Pinot Noir, now that we found, are one of those varietals that are super susceptible to smoke taint. So that was the whites. With the reds, we started bringing in lots of Pinot Noir that were heavily affected. We pressed off immediately 2 lots. One we ran through an ultrafiltration unit with BA filtration as juice. It's hard to tell if there's any smoky, impact at that point because there's so much sugar in the juice. You can't tell sensory if it worked or not. And turns out after fermentation, since we filtered it, we stripped pretty much everything out of the fruit and it got stock fermentation. So learned that. And then the second lot of Pinot Noir that we pressed off immediately, we dumped that over Syrah skins that weren't affected, hoping for a slight improvement. And, we saw a little bit, but we weren't doing trials back to back, so we couldn't really tell if it was making an impact. We kind of felt like, yeah, it's a little bit better one than the other, but there was no for sure answer. And at this point, everybody was talking about sending samples to Australia to get tested for, a lot of the stuff that Ray's been doing. And with a 2-month turnaround for analysis, that wasn't going to help me. So we decided, let's not do it. We're going to just save these samples and do it by sensory. Until I found Ray. But so for the majority of our red wines during fermentation, we stuck with our traditional fermentation protocols, adding enzymes, adding oak fines, and in some cases adding tannin, knowing that it was going to get stripped out later, thinking that reverse osmosis was the only option, and everybody said it was going to get stripped. We said, let's just start with more stuffing in the wines and throw everything at it, get everything in there, extract everything we can out of the wines, and then if it gets stripped out later, we'll deal with it later. So a lot of that, adding oak right there in the fermenters, got tossed out a lot of testing right out the window. So other things that we did during harvest was we worked with Para, the flash détente company that's part of Palenque. They came up and they did trials on Mourvedre with a 12-hour and a 24-hour maceration time. And it worked. It seemed to bring a lot of the fruity characters out of the wines, and compared to the control, we actually saw some changes there. However, during harvest, flashing, then macerating for 12 hours and 24 hours, only to flash again, then press off, then cool down, then start the fermentation, created some really long harvest hours. So it works, but it's a lot of labor and a lot of effort going into it. And in the end, you ended up with flashed fruit, which is great for some programs, but it's not great for every single program in your portfolio. So it was a tool that kind of worked, but it may not be perfect for everything. So that was during harvest. Post-harvest, we started working with contend. And like I said, one of the first lots we had was a Pinot Noir and Cabernet, and they said, send me a couple of bottles, and I said, I'm going to send you 19,000 gallons. I'm not sure what else to do with it. So they did. I got to play around with it, and it was amazing. We were really shocked by how clean it came out. And initially, the wine was stripped and kind of wonky and disjointed, but letting it sit for a few months later, it was starting to come back together. We were like, okay, now we know we can push it a little further, strip it out even more, and the fruitiness and the balance will come back around. And we sent down lightly affected lots, medium affected lots, and highly affected lots. And in some of the high affected lots, 10 months later, that smoke character is starting to come back. So it worked, but it's not perfect. And it's not, and when I say smoke character coming back, it's not like the big ashy character in the back of your throat, but there still is a lingering kind of astringency and just a stale character where your wine's not going to be 100% what it was without having a smoke event. So also during or post-harvest, we did carbon finding. Tried that on one of those Pinot Noir lots. It wasn't that effective. We used Enartis's phenol-free. We used that on the Pinot Noir and the Pinot Gris. Didn't really do anything on the Pinot Noir. The Pinot Gris cleaned up beautifully, and we were able to, get it out, blend it, get it out into the market, and so it's out there, and can't really tell. We ended up purchasing an ultrafiltration unit from VA Filtration. We processed, some wines that we already processed through Contech. We processed them through the ultrafiltration unit with carbon columns, and we saw some character reduction there, but it wasn't, again, 100%. And with the ultrafiltration, it does eventually kind of come back out later, and you may have to filter again. And so some lots we filtered many times. The ultrafiltration is relatively gentle on the wine, but it's not a perfect solution because of the time lag of characters coming back and then having to reprocess. But we're still in the process of actually we're running stuff today at the winery using carbon columns, but also trying absorption resins and different things like that with the ultrafiltration unit, just to see what works. So we're still actually doing trials today. I think the big thing that we learned is there's not one treatment that fixes it. It's a combination of treatments, and it's very different for every single wine. And it's just it's not over yet. We're still working on these wines. We're still processing them. But the one thing that we did learn is that the earlier you treat the wines, the better off you are. The flavors come back. You remove so much more smoke characters early on versus if you let it sit around for too long and then try to treat it later. We learned a lot of things. We tested a lot of stuff, and we didn't necessarily do all of the analytics on it. We did some, but in the end, it was, it's great to be working for a company that just says, let's figure this out, and let's do what we can. We're going to try everything, and just, put some effort out there. So I'm half the reason why I'm up here today is to get the conversation started, open it up, let's talk about it, and get solutions for this. Let's see what everybody else is doing, and communicate and share ideas and move forward. So.
Great. Thank you. Well, thank you all. It's a lot of information, and I would assume there are some questions out there.
Thank you. I have a question for Dr. Oberholzer. Actually, two-part. The first part of the question is, you mentioned in the beginning that the volatile phenols are diffusing rapidly through the skin. So my question is there been any discussion, science, testing about the movement of the phenols through the leaf? And if there is, how do they compare later on qualitatively? And then the second part of the question is, we know, or we sense, or we're hearing that that grapes that are growing, hence my first question, grapes that are growing in wildflower condition, whether it's 2 hours in the smoke or sitting in the smoke for a week, tend to have more radical organoleptic consequences after. And can you comment on that as compared to wines that may have been inundated with smoke in the fermenter in the winery prior to harvest? So I think that is a really, really key issue that's come up in the industry in the last couple of years, is to compare the two, and why, if you would.
Okay. So the first, yes, both the grape and the leaves absorb the same volatile phenols. Okay, so your leaves can be a source of the same smoke taint markers as the grapes. There's very little indication that there's translocation from the grapes to the leaf, or from the leaf to the grapes. The leaves are a source of volatile phenol, so you definitely, if you could, you don't want to include that in any of your fermentations, because that will just add more. But we don't think there's a lot of movement in between the two. Also, as Joy mentioned, washing the grapes, like we said, it's not on the outside, it's in the inside. But that doesn't mean some of the ash that may sit on the outside don't still have volatile phenols sitting on the ash that can add. It depends on how old that ash is. There's a lot of variables there. The second part of your question, again.
Would you like to repeat the second part of the question?
No, I just need one word and then I'll remember. Yes. So we do know, yes, I know, I just need one and then I'm going to remember. So basically, the duration and the length of smoke, definitely the fresher the smoke, the higher the impact. We know that for a fact. And if that smoke gets fed during a long period, yes, it can mean basically as little as 2 hours of fresh smoke may be enough. And the longer the period, because it will just build up in the grape. The grape is like a source, it's like a sink, it's absorbing it, the more impacted it will be. But we also know if the smoke is really old, and with old we think more than 24 hours, but we really don't we really need to work on what is the half-life of volatile phenols. So that definitely has an impact, how fresh the smoke is that gets to your grapes, and then the length of time of fresh smoke. Then grapes on the vine versus those perhaps picked and in the winery, or those fermenting. So what happens is when grapes are picked, you still have enzymes that it's alive. But the longer after they've been picked, the more their activity decreases. So basically, over time, those enzymes that glycosylate those volatile phenols will decrease in activity, so less of that will happen. So it may decrease the impact somehow because it's not on the vine itself. When you have wine fermenting, we're less concerned about smoke exposure, because while it's actively fermenting and pushing in carbon dioxide, you won't get absorbance of volatile phenols. And even if you do get some absorbance, you won't get the glycosylated forms, because the enzyme that does that do not live in an alcohol environment. Okay, so if you have any absorbing happening, it would only be the free form, which you will need much lighter treatment to remove most of that. It's really the bound that is a little bit more difficult to remove and do result in more excessive treatment of the wine. Does that answer your question?
Okay, very good.
This is kind of related. In the spirit of trying to prevent the problem in the first place, is there any work being done in the vineyard besides washing things off? Is there a barrier that can be applied to the grapes or the leaves to prevent the problem in the first place?
Yes, so there are research in the world looking at that. Australia is looking at that. Canada is looking at that. We're looking at that a little bit. There was a study published not long ago looking at kaolin, and it had variable results because for some varieties it improved and for others it made it worse, which tells me not much of an impact. Canada has looked at a biopolymer that they've sprayed on grapes, and they say it's unpublished. It's going to be published soon, and they seem to say that they had very good results with that. Thing is, you want something that's easily applied using equipment you already have, like what you use for your fungicides or pesticide sprayers. And you need to be very easily able to wash it off at the winery so that it doesn't go into your wine, or it needs to settle out and be totally inert, which is quite a big ask. But we are looking into it, and there seems to be some potential in biopolymers.
This question's for Joy. Post-treatment, what have you found to be the best approaches to finish a wine for market, say using a bunch of French oak or finishing oak? What's been the best approach for you?
Again, it depends on the wine and what style you're going for. But, we've seen in some of our, lower end wine programs, a little bit of that residual sugar does cover up that astringency on the finish. Oak does help. There's lots that we've put in French oak and American oak. And, in the beginning, we're, after it was bottled, we're tasting it. Is that smoky or is it oak? We can't really tell anymore. So, that definitely worked. I don't think American or French, one or the other. I think probably whatever would go with that wine for that style. But it does mask it. We did a little bit of work with tannins and finishing tannins. And I think that does help too, especially with that astringent finish that is there. But yeah, we've been trying a lot of stuff, and I encourage you to, try everything, because you're not really sure what's going to work, and especially because every single line is different. It's going to change all the time.
Everyone keeps talking about wood smoke, but we all know there was more burning. There were homes, businesses, etc. Is there any information about those other chemicals going into the grapes?
So I've done some work on this. It's not something I talk about a lot because we're really still investigating it. So I had some wines that I helped a winery. I sent it away, and we looked at a whole range of plasticizers, and we didn't find anything. Then I've always also worked with the wines that I made that were smoke impacted. With somebody at Food Science, and we specifically looked at the kind of things you get, the treatments you get on furniture when that burns. So it's flame retardants that you actually use on furniture, looking if any of that is in the wines. And we've used both control and smoke impacted wines, and they had the same amount of, you have noise, there's small amounts of all these compounds in everything we unfortunately ingest, but there were really no differences between the controls and the smoke impacted wines. So we are looking at it at this point in time. We haven't found anything to be of major concern. But there's a lot of other compounds to look at, and like I said, I've only looked at a minimal amount of wines. So it's definitely something that we need to continue looking at.
I think Washington State's also looking at different ignition products, right? So different, and they're I think they're looking more at what grows natively around the vineyards, and they had again very different results based on rabbit grass or whatever they was growing around naturally. And I think I was at a seminar there, and I think they were talking about doing some research as well into the construction materials and wallboard and gypsum and other roofing, I think roofing materials as well. I thought they were going to do something about that.
Okay, very good.
This is probably a question for you, mainly Dr. Oberholzer, although if someone else has information, I'd be interested too. Just wondering if there's been any research or information about absorption of smoke into, like a lot of us have tanks in outdoor areas, and maybe you bring in fruit that doesn't have smoke taint, but can it absorb smoke from the atmosphere? And what, how dense does that smoke might have to be for that to happen? Just wondering what kind of information is out there on that, if any.
There is very little. It's very, very difficult. This is the problem. You really need to be able to analyze the smoke itself, the atmosphere, and do the predictive power. We really don't know. This is ongoing research. I know Australia is looking into it. I'm starting to look at it, working with atmospheric scientists, because they really have the equipment to do this kind of thing. But yes, if you have grapes and you have fresh smoke with volatile phenols in it, even if it's picked, it can absorb it. It slows down the longer it's being picked. You will have less problems of enzymatic activity, glycosylating these compounds. But yes, it's possible for them to absorb volatile phenols if it's still in the smoke. This is the problem. You can see smoke, and that smoke can only be carbon, or it may have things that can be detrimental to your grapes or to your wine, and you don't know. And that's a problem. We know the fresher, the more at risk you are. The older the smoke, the less risk. Australia has some anecdotal evidence that indicated that after 24 hours, smoke washed over McLaren Vale, and they had no problems with any smoke-impacted wines because the smoke was 24 hours old. But that's totally anecdotal. We really need to do detailed studies determining the half-life of volatile phenols in the atmosphere.
So one of the Winnovation Award winners on Tuesday night, I think they have you ought to check out their booth here. It's called Go Fermenters, and they do tank liners. And he actually said during the awards ceremony, he was sitting next to me, and when he found out that we were working on smoke taint, he goes, "Just put it in one of my liner bags." He goes, "It won't absorb anything." I said, "Well, it's already there to be, but to prevent it, that might be something to look at that you use in emergency situations when the winds are blowing in the right direction." Right?
Yes, this is a question for Ray. When you analyzed your grapes, you used the Gerstle twister and TDU technology. Do you think that it would work at all with SPEME fibers, or would they not concentrate the sample enough?
I don't think SPEME is sensitive enough. I know, like for ethyl phenol, it's not. However, there's been a new development with solid phase microextraction. Gerstle about 6 months ago introduced a thin film SPEME. It's a membrane, 20 millimeters by 4 millimeters. It's carbon, and then it's coated with divinyl benzene. And you can expose that to wine, submerge it in wine for an hour, and rinse it off, pat it dry, and do thermal desorption with that. And we just completed studies last week with that technique, and we doubled our sensitivity with that technique. One of the problems that we have with the chemistry analysis of the wine taints is there's no standard method that people are using. That's kind of a handicap, but it's also good that we're still open-minded to trying new techniques, new extraction techniques, and we're investigating this TF SPEME. I think it's going to be even more useful than the twister.
Well, thank you all, and thank you, panel. It was very interesting. I encourage anyone with additional questions, if you guys are willing to stick around for a few minutes, please feel free to come on up and/or reach out at any time. We look forward to talking more about smoke taint. So thanks.